Welcome to another album analysis. In today's video, we're looking at the 8th studio album from the American rock band Fall Out Boy, titled So Much for Stardust. This is the follow-up to 2018's Mania, an album that very heavily divided Fall Out Boy fans. They went too far down the rabbit hole and moved too far away from their original scope, their original sound, and they felt very uncomfortable on that album, and it certainly showed in many of the reviews and the feelings that the fans had for that particular album. And because of that, the band have decided almost to, no one say go back to the drawing board, but with this album it's almost as if they've walked back down that path they've been going over the past 12 or so years, and they've decided to take an alternate path following on from Folie à Deux. It's almost like they've decided, right, we should have taken this route instead, let's retrace our steps and move forward as if we had taken this alternate path. And to assist them with doing that, they have recruited Neil Avron, who actually was the producer for albums such as Under the Cork Tree, Infinity on High and Folie à Deux. And that alternate path certainly seems very interesting from what the album does hold, almost signalling a reference back to many of their earlier works, whilst also showing this development and this continuation without just sounding like a carbon copy of some of their more highly regarded albums. So will this album prove to be an astronomical success or simply be a fading star? Let's take a look at it track by track. Opening the album, we do have the first track that we did get to hear in the form of a single from this album, Love from the Other Side, with this very interesting piano string open, delving then straight into this very punchy, snappy rock, and really showing just off this first single how they're planning on returning to that rock sound, really kind of diving away from those electronic elements that we had seen on some of their other albums, and just focusing on their roots and focusing on the sound that made them such a successful band in the first place. And many of the lyrics reflect this idea of a journey, talking about the apocalypse coming out from the other side of that. And the apocalypse could be the global pandemic, even since it's the first album they've produced since then, or it could reference to Mania. They didn't like what they were doing on that. They've now got past that. They're on the other side and they're back to producing some fantastic music. And this track really does serve its purpose for providing that, this very rockacious energy that really does reek of older material from albums such as Infinity on High, really bringing these driving guitars back in and these really strong, quick paces from Andy Hurley that really just help to push their music forward, which make it so much more energetic and easy to dance to, which is definitely a feature that we're going to see as the album does progress. Then we do move into Heartbreak Feels So Good, the second single we did get to hear before the release of the album, and this shows more of an electronic styling. They haven't fully dropped it off the face of the earth, but they've honed it, they have refined it on this album when they do make use of it. And this is another track that really feels like it's the band referring to Mania, that almost their fans' hearts were broken upon the release of that album because they felt like the band they had known for all these years was finally dead and it was going to be this horrible ending after a very strong and illustrious career. And that's even referenced in the lyrics such as, is there a word for bad miracle? In one sense, that album wasn't successful, but it also showed them, gave them the idea that, right, we need to stop doing this. We're kind of pushing ourselves too far away from what we wanted to write, what we wanted to achieve, and they've kind of learned from it. And we are going to see this constant toss-up in the actual lyrics between this idea of, it could be referenced around certainly the pandemic and how it affected their mental health. It's something the band have been very vocal about, but also touching on their musical style as well, their songwriting process. So there's going to be a lot of different things that you can really draw from many of the songs on this album. And I especially like the lyric, we were going to use the roads as a ramp to take off. This idea that they've learned, they've used the kind of previous failures as this ramp that they have taken off and have bounced back with this album. Then moving into track 3, we do have Hold Me Like a Grudge, with this very funky, stompy bass line open, which I think is really great. It's nice to see they're constantly switching up with every single track, and that is the beauty of this album. There's not two tracks that really sound the same. They play with so many different influences, so many different styles, pretty much across the entirety of it, that it stops it from being bland or just like a carbon copy of earlier material. And this is definitely a song that really highlights Patrick Stump's very smart songwriting. We do see it constantly being thrown in throughout the entire album, but I love things such as Hold Me Like a Grudge. It's a song about kind of failing relationships that don't work. This idea of hold me in your arms, but instead of that, it's hold me like a grudge. You're really holding this against somebody, this failed relationship. So it has an almost universal application. You can really see how it could blend into a lot of different meanings, and it's a very smart play on words for the actual lyric title itself and the way they blend the lyrics around that. So I do love that. The only thing that annoyed me a little bit on this track is the overuse of clapping. There were a couple of points where they've used it as an effect that I just felt was a little bit too much. At times it wasn't really needed, and it just kind of distracted you because it was almost like something else was trying to get your attention from the track. Then moving into track 4, we do have Fake Out, which has this very strong pace with a more acoustic touch, also a very 80s radio rock feel to it. And it's a song that talks quite heavily about the idea of this fear of commitment. I didn't take the love when I had the chance. So often you have something in your life that you really want to pursue, you really want to do, but you don't always take the chance. It doesn't have to just be people, it can be a dream you've got, it can be something you really want to try. And the band are kind of touching on that as well, about some of the things they've wanted to try, some of the things they've wanted to do as a band, and it hasn't always worked. And now they have that fear of committing to certain things because they're not really sure how it's going to be received or perceived. Then we do have Heaven Iowa, and this is a song that has a much slower pace to it. It has these big soaring building moments that I really did enjoy for this album. These really strong builds into the chorus where Patrick Stump really just blasts those levels up, really shows the prominence and the depth of his voice, even though he does it on a lot of the other tracks. This is one where he really soars with the vocals as opposed to just playing around with them. And I really liked with this track the idea of star-crossed lovers. Again, this play on words, they use it quite heavily throughout the album, and it just shows really smart songwriting in the way they're able to show different messages. You think of star-crossed lovers as very sweet, so when you've got scar-crossed lovers, it's this opposite. It's this idea of the end of a relationship, these two people that are destined to be together but couldn't be because of the amount of scars in the relationship or from their past or something like that. And we've also got many of the lyrics that do throw back to older Fall Out Boy songs. It's almost like a spider web where some of the songs could be linked in with other tracks they've released over these. They've covered a lot of the same themes, and they really want to touch back, not just instrumentally but also lyrically, by tying in some of these ideas they did have on previous albums. Then in track 6 we do have So Good Right Now, and this is a really interesting track. This had a very 50s, 60s Motown swing feel to it, and the actual opening was very reminiscent of Thurston Harris's Little Bitty Pretty One from the late 50s. And it's interesting because they've thrown in so many different references to different tracks, drawn so many influences from lots of different styles, and that really does help this album to be very much a technical, a dream coat of different things that have been brought in, but it never sounds too kind of all over the place. It does feel like the album fits quite well together despite them exploring lots of these different styles. And this song really does invoke this idea of this pessimistic approach to the future of something good. And that's, again, tying back to the band. They had high hopes of things like that, and then things kind of started to fall apart, things started to become a little bit dashed. And it's also their view and outlook of the world as well. The fact that something can go from being really good to very bad in an almost instant. You can have a very positive approach, but then kind of worry that it's going to collapse very, very quickly. And that's shown through a lot of the lyrics on this song. Then we do get a little reprieve in track 7, which is the Pink Seashell, which is actually a clip from the 1994 film Reality Bites featuring Ethan Hawke. And this film is actually all about graduates facing life after college. And I do feel like the band have put this in because it's almost about their story. That at a very young age, they had a large amount of success, and they've been rolling with that ever since. It's that idea of maybe not knowing how to actually come against that, and this idea of the fact that the film is taken from Reality Bites, that biting of reality when things come crashing down. So we see this constant reference to the entire album of just kind of these challenges of life, these tackling these difficult situations and how to try and deal with them. Then in track 8 we do have I Am My Own Muse, which the title is actually pulled from a Frida Kahlo quote. So again, making more references. They've really looked into the kind of the history books and really interspersed themselves throughout a lot of different cultures and references and all sorts of things for this song. And certainly it feels like this song was produced by Andrew Lloyd Webber. It is very, very theatrical in its nature, with many of the things that it does include. It almost invokes this idea of grandeur, and also it invokes a couple of different things. Like there's very much this like Michael Jackson-esque quip on some of the lyrics, got to throw this year away. It's almost got that same styling that you would hear on tracks such as Dirty Diana. Then we've also got the bridge, which is a bit of a play on a 60s Chubby Checker song, and also this very Brian May-esque guitar, almost Queen-sounding element that's thrown in towards the end of the track. This track is very much all over the place, but they've pulled it together very well, and they've included lots of different things. Obviously, we've got the orchestral elements that have been running throughout the album as well, which they've made heavy use, started to make use of on Infinity on High going forward, and they've really liked to explore that again, but they've certainly refined it and certainly made it much stronger and really given it that emphasis when it needs to on some of these more theatrical blasé tracks. tracks. In at track 9 we do have Flu Game, which is an NBA reference to Michael Jordan, the time that he played when he wasn't very well, but he got through hardship and actually managed to kind of play very well. So an interesting way to look at it with the actual title of this track, but that is exactly what it's about. It's about kind of making your way through hardships and really coming out of the other side. And the chorus is also very reminiscent of Panic! At the Disco's Emperor's New Clothes, with a lot of these quirky elements that are really thrown into this song, and it really does add a little bit of an extra effect. It almost makes it very tribal at times as well. So again, just more and more things being brought in out of nowhere, but are being used to such good effect. It's nice to see that they've kind of refined a lot of the playfulness that they did with some of their albums kind of from 2010 onwards, when they started to delve into more electronic and different elements. They've really honed that back, learned from it, and used it on this album. And the lyrics do also sometimes reflect this idea of relationships. I carved out a place in this world for two, but it's empty without you. This idea of the hardships of relationships, the ups and downs that everybody has to go through, and it's something they've touched on constantly, this idea of relationships throughout most of the band's career. Then in track 10 we do have Baby Annihilation, which sounds just like it sounds like a very metal title. That it certainly sounds very graphic and just weird and disturbing, but it's actually the first spoken Pete Wentz feature since the $20 Nosebleed track on Folie à Deux. It's really interesting to see how they've returned that, but that's showing again that they're kind of taking that alternate path. They're rewinding the years, taking the alternate path and continuing on the story and the building on the kind of elements they did throw onto that album. So not kind of one of the biggest things, but it's just notable that they've thrown it on, made it its own track on the actual listing, and really just kind of let him kind of become the prominent part and really talk about what he wants to do on that particular song. Then at 11 we do have the Kintsugi Kid 10 Years, and Kintsugi is the art of putting broken pieces back together with gold. It's almost like a Japanese philosophy that they really love to invoke, and you really see that through this actual album as well. The band felt at times like they've been broken, whether it be through mental health, through the actual band really struggling to find those creative flares as well, and this is the idea, they're kind of putting themselves back together. They've managed to find the kind of pieces they need just to really reform themselves, refine themselves and go forward. And despite Joe kind of making the album then taking a step away, he's still been able to contribute to this entire album. Then in for track 12 we do have What a Time to Be Alive, and it's very interesting, this track, because they like to throw a lot of juxtaposition and a lot of contrast into this album all the way through it, and this is about the world before the pandemic almost, very upbeat. They make great use of trumpets and talk about how strange life is post-pandemic, and it's very weird how they talk about life in almost a very negative way, but with this upbeat feeling. They're kind of questioning life, but almost you've got this jolliness to it that really, which again, it makes you want to dance along to, bop your head to, and really get involved with. So it is great how they've kind of taken these contrasting elements and made them use of them on songs such as this to really give them that full effect that they were looking for. And that's also been shown through the new kind of symbol that the band have been using with the yin yang, with kind of one half being happy, one half being sad. They've shown that through this logo, that this is what they really want to focus on, this idea of this strange new world that they're exploring themselves, this world that they've been going through over the past 5 years, and this idea of uncertainty in life. Then rounding out the album we do have the title track, which is very orchestral in its nature, and it's actually got this really strong opening to it, and I have loved some of the elements they have used on this album, certainly with the strings, the horns. They've not been used on every song, they've not been used to really drown out the actual rock elements they have included, but it's just been used to add a bit of extra blasé, a little bit of extra effect to add to those theatrics throughout the whole album, and I really do like that because it just gives another layer, another kind of almost trick to their repertoire that they can use going forward, and it's something that they've kind of built on from the days when they released Infinity on High. And this song also does really heavily invoke their new logo as well, this idea of duality. Split me right down the middle is one of the lyrics that is included, and it does have these very playful vocals. When we've seen Patrick stuff, he's never been one that's really dropped off in the terms of quality on his vocals. He's still able to really vibrate his voice, really show that strong, deep and high range, and also show that he can really hold some of these notes on some of these more soaring tracks. And the song does serve as the perfect closer, making great use of repetition of some of the lyrics from Love from the Other Side, but almost having this more laid back version, this stripped back version. It's almost like, but it's not used as just a kind of repeat song from the start of the album. It's actually just used in one section just to kind of show this idea of this start and this end almost, to really just close out the album in a very nice way. Overall, this is a very messy album, but in a good way, I feel. This is an album that's got lots packed into it. There is so many different things, but one of the main things they've done is they've taken those rock roots that they did have and they've really made use of that, but then added different things. That has been their foundation, and then they've added orchestral elements. They've had lots of references on top of that. They've then thrown in some different instrumentals and some different sections, and then some different references to things such as 60s tracks, to disco, to funk, and they've just built up this really strong multicolored cake that they have actually managed to construct as the album. So despite the fact that at the time the actual process of putting it together may be quite messy, the finished product certainly comes out very clean. And the band also avoided going a little bit too over the top with the theatrics. It's something that we did see with Panic at the Disco's most recent album, Viva Las Vengeance. That went way over the top and it did sort of spoil the album, and they've managed to avoid doing that on this, but they've done it in a way that it is very effective. It does add these extra bits of power to some of the tracks, and it really does show that they've really refined the sound and really made it work. The only thing I would say that actually does hold this album back is that there are times where the band do feel a little bit uncertain about what they're really trying to convey, and they don't always really kind of get it across in the clearest method. Instrumentally very strong, and Patrick's vocals, despite having these very sensible, very funny lyrics at times that tie into a lot of different things, if you didn't know what a lot of these references were, at times you can leave you feeling a little bit lost as to what this album is really trying to do. So instrumentally very, very strong, but just sometimes on the lyrical side it can lead you to get a bit lost despite playing with all these different styles and references. And for those reasons I'm going to be giving the album an 8 out of 10. I certainly feel it's very deserved. This is definitely one of the best albums I think since probably Infinity on High, and it's not quite as good as Infinity on High or Under the Cork Tree, but it's certainly better than many of the albums they have produced since then, and certainly shows the development within the band, and I really like to see that. I like to see them making a strong return to form, really showing these theatrical elements and lots of different things and lots of references, really showing how they've been inspired by lots of different styles of music. I mean, Patrick Stump has even said himself he's inspired by people such as Elvis and some of the sounds of the 60s, those Motown sounds. He really draws inspiration from a lot of things, and that shows through very well on this album. So that will be everything for today's video, but how do you feel about this album? Do you think it lives up to the early standards of Fall Out Boy, or do you wish maybe they just continued just with following on from Mini but tried to tone things down a little bit? I would love to know your thoughts, and let me know as well what your favourite track on this album is. I certainly loved I Am My Own Muse. I did really enjoy that very theatrical style that really drew a lot of inspiration from lots of different things and then clustered them all into one particular track, but I would certainly love to know your thoughts. And as always, if you want to see more content like this, then please do feel free to subscribe, and I will see you in the next album analysis.